Welcome to Doing the Work, a Naples Integrated Recovery podcast. My name is Brian, and this space is for anyone who's tired of surviving the same emotional and behavioral loops, whether that's anxiety, trauma, addiction, or problems in your relationships. Around here, we cut the surface level advice and sugarcoating, no platitudes or bumper sticker wisdom. We focus on clarity, responsibility, emotional discipline, and the courage to look at yourself honestly so that you can stop repeating old patterns and start living with intention instead of reaction. Let's get into it. Today I want to talk about that I see a handful of clients who are in long-term addiction recovery programs, and many of them have been sober for a decade or 2 decades and still have perpetual internal problems. And with that, many of them are dependent on going to a meeting every day to feel like they have their sanity. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't do that if that is what works for you. But today I wanted to talk about an underlying theme that I see with a lot of them and some of the healing that I think is available or possible outside of that fellowship. And again, I want to make sure that I'm very clear. I'm not telling anybody not to go to meetings if you need to go to meetings. If that is what gives you structure and connection to others, you should absolutely be doing that. But I want to talk about a condition that is underneath that for a lot of people, and maybe this also exists if you don't have addictions, but you have trauma. So today I'm talking about broken mirror syndrome and how trauma distorts your self-perception in real time. This broken mirror syndrome is something that happens when trauma disrupts a person's ability to evaluate themselves accurately. Introspection still happens. They have the ability to self-reflect. Like I said, a lot of these people are sober. Maybe they've done a 4th step. They've done an inventory of their resentments and character flaws. But the problem is distortion. The mirror is intact enough for them to function, but fractured enough to misrepresent. And I hear it all the time in lived material in the office. A client might say something like, every step that I make, I question if I'm doing the right thing. And a statement like that is not philosophical, it's physiological, because it's a nervous system that is treating ordinary decisions as potential moral threats. And that kind of an internal dialogue starts before the day even begins. So I have one client that talks about how he wakes up and immediately his brain is active with, what are you going to do about this? Or you messed this up, or you need to fix this. There's a biological piece to this. Cortisol naturally rises within the first half hour of you waking up. That's normal. That is not unique to people with trauma. It's your body turning the lights on. And in someone whose system is wired for threat, that natural cortisol rise pairs with threat scanning. The brain starts searching for problems, and it pulls up material that matches the tone of the body. If shame is familiar, then shame-based memories are what's going to come up first, and then the day starts from a sense of deficit. A client that I saw last week said that when he wakes up in the morning, it's almost like it is photographic of the mistakes that he made in the last 24 hours. And that is what high emotional arousal does. When something happens under strong stress, it gets encoded with more sensory detail. Later, when something else remotely similar happens, the body then reacts quickly. Muscles might tighten, heart rate shift, focus narrows, and the body feels like something is wrong. The mind follows that signal and concludes something is certainly wrong now. So, for example, this client isn't waking up and deciding to criticize himself. He's waking up and then his nervous system is moving first, and then the interpretation comes after. Now, one area that like 12-step programs can be very helpful is before a person goes into thinking mode and scanning mode and threat mode, they might recommend prayer first. So I had one client that mentioned he puts his cigarette pack under his bed, which if you've ever been a smoker, that's usually like one of the first things you do when you wake up is have a cigarette and coffee. And so he would put his cigarette pack under his bed with the intention of getting out of bed and immediately getting down on his knees first to pray and to slow his brain down before all these other catastrophic thoughts come. It forced him to connect with his higher power first. And whether you have a spiritual lens or not, it can really, it doesn't have to be prayer. It could just be stopping before going into full-blown threat mode, that you are pausing first. And then if you want to frame it as a prayer, to ask for direction through the day or to ask for the ability to pause, so be it. That can be a really helpful intervention here. But I want to go back to this broken mirror and the distorted interpretation, because this client, for example, talks about waking up and then brain going all over the place of all the mistakes from yesterday. And one of them might have been his partner expressing a need that she says, when you shut down, I feel alone. And that is a behavior-focused statement. But his internal translation becomes, I'm a failure as a husband. And the jump from the behavior to identity is immediate. There is no gap. That jump reflects associative learning built in early attachment. He identifies a father whose voice was critical, or he identifies a mother who was opinionated and judgmental. In childhood, feedback did not consistently land as guidance. It often carried an evaluation of character. And then the result of that is that the nervous system pairs relational input with threat of rejection. When a current relational feedback appears, like his wife, then the nervous retrieves old pairing. What happens there is that the prefrontal cortex has limited time to differentiate. If this has all gotten too abstract, maybe go back to the podcast on the neuroscience of suffering and spiritual principles as a real intervention for trauma and an activated nervous system. But as a quick recap, your amygdala is your threat detection part of your brain, and your prefrontal cortex is like the brakes or the adult in the room or the rational thinking, slow it down part of the brain. And if the body is already activated, then differentiation weakens. And the statement from the wife here, I feel alone when you withdraw, becomes, in his mind, with that lessened prefrontal cortex, you are inadequate. The mirror does not show behavior, it shows defect. And so he might say in counseling, I can turn anything into a criticism. And he's got good insight that he knows that there is distortion. He also might say things like, I should know better. I've been sober for 20 years. This reveals another layer. Achievement becomes another measuring instrument for inadequacy. Sobriety, which represented sustained discipline and resilience and not picking up through all of the shit that life throws at him, becomes evidence that he has no excuse for ongoing struggle. And so now we've got a moral inflation layer on top of trauma distortion. His system also shows hypervigilance. When he is at work, he is constantly monitoring himself. Am I doing this right? Are they judging me? Is this client going to come back? And that is predictive error monitoring running continuously. So now you've got chronic sympathetic activation, pushing the brain to anticipate evaluation before it has even occurred. And over time, this level of monitoring can drain cognitive resources. This client describes rushing through the day just so that he can get home, just to shut down. And that shutdown reflects a parasympathetic collapse after prolonged sympathetic strain. That's your threat detection strain. And with that, the inner critic pushes hard, the system exhausts, and motivation drops. So this broken mirror syndrome is not self-awareness, it's self-surveillance fused with shame-conditioned interpretation. Part of the distortion also shows up in decision paralysis. This client, like many other clients, says, just tell me what to do. And when early developmental environments pair mistakes with disproportionate consequences, then autonomous choice becomes threatening. If someone else is the one who is always dictating what action you should take, then internal blame will decrease if an outcome fails. And that deferral to other people, asking someone else what to do, asking the therapist what to do, might reduce some immediate anxiety, but it also erodes self-trust, which is why some people feel that they need to go to a meeting every day, because they have deferred that autonomy elsewhere, to a group, to a sponsor, to somebody else to always tell them what they should be doing or thinking. There's another distortion that is in all of this, and that's martyrdom. This client says, I'll fall on the sword, it's my fault. And if you've ever heard that phrase or those phrases, that pattern usually starts as an attachment preservation. Taking excessive responsibility can reduce conflict intensity if you are in a volatile environment. And as an adult, the pattern persists even if it's unnecessary. So, broken mirror syndrome reflects a system that learned to equate feedback with threat and imperfection with relational instability. So they might be introspective, but the reflection is warped by historical emotional charge. If you are going to have constructive self-criticism, then it requires a stable, not broken, reflective surface. But in this system, that surface is still fractured. Now, if you strip this down to mechanics, broken mirror syndrome follows a consistent sequence. 1 is the trigger, 2 is a physiological activation, like the flooding in the brain and the threat detection, 3, a memory retrieval of something that's an earlier experience, 4, identity conclusion, like I'm a failure, I'm a bad son, I'm whatever. So I'm going to use this client as an example. Trigger, partner expresses frustration. Physiological activation is he feels tension in his body, that the heart rate increases, his attention narrows. Then there's a memory retrieval, stored experiences of his parents criticizing him. Then the identity conclusion, I'm a bad husband. That leap from behavior to identity is the central fracture, because in a regulated system, feedback travels through a different route. The brain processes a statement semantically. The prefrontal cortex evaluates the context. The person distinguishes between I did something that impacted you and I am fundamentally flawed or broken. The broken mirror collapses those two categories, and the collapse then becomes reinforced by perfectionism. So if you're a people pleaser who has perfectionism, that's not about excellence, it is threat avoidance internally. The problem is that perfection is not attainable. When inevitable mistakes occur, the self-attack intensifies, the inner critic escalates. You should have known better. You've been sober for 20 years. How are you still effing this up? Or other people in AA don't struggle like I do. And that comparison distortion amplifies shame, because now you're comparing yourself to other people in recovery who may not have that same trauma load. For example, the person who had mentored me in 12-step recovery, he didn't, at least he's never shared with me, any of the same emotional wounds and developmental wounds that I had. So our recoveries are completely different. And for him to then just say, you need to do it the way that I did it, well, obviously that's not going to be the right complete fit, right? Because we've got different histories of what brought us into addiction. A person's trauma load alters their baseline sensitivity. Developmental environments shape stress response thresholds, and comparing outcomes without also comparing histories produces an inaccurate conclusion when you start measuring yourself against other people that you meet in peer-led recovery that are having a different outcome even though you're both quote-unquote sober. That there's also a moral overextension here, because this client, for example, referenced an idea that his father had given him, that every criticism contains truth. And that principle, when used in moderation, can promote accountability, but in a trauma-conditioned system, it becomes a cognitive accelerant, because if every criticism contains a truth, then every complaint justifies global condemnation. So he hears a request for engagement from his partner, and internally, that becomes confirmation of a defect. The broken mirror magnifies his small distortions into a full-blown character judgment. We also need to examine the internal conflict that he describes, that there's a punitive voice, stop being weak, get your shit together, and then there's a shutdown response that comes from that. I just don't want to do anything. I just want this to pass. I just want to lay in bed. From a nervous system perspective, this reflects oscillation between sympathetic overdrive, that's the threat detection scanning overdrive, and then the parasympathetic withdrawal. His inner critic activates sympathetic arousal. Then his energy mobilizes and the body is starting to prepare for how to correct. And if sustained activation becomes overwhelming, then the system flips into collapse, where then parasympathetic is active, motivation drops, and numbness increases, and you just want to hide, lay in bed, and just avoid everything. That oscillation creates serious confusion internally, because people will experience themselves as inconsistent when in reality, the system is just cycling between two different activation states. I want to go back and revisit where I talked about decision paralysis and asking for external. Now, a lot of clients come in and they need a lot of steering, and I don't mind helping with that. But if a person says something like, "Tell me what to do," it reflects risk avoidance. Autonomous decision making exposes people to potential internal prosecution. And if someone else is the one that is defining action, me telling someone what they should be doing, then they can attribute any kind of an outcome externally back to me. This will reduce anticipated shame. But over time, that deferral to outside, what my sponsor tells me to do, what my therapist tells me to do, that outside deferral prevents the development of internal authority. Self-trust requires the ability to make decisions, to tolerate imperfection, and then surviving the emotional aftermath without collapse. But the broken mirror interferes with that process, because any mistake that a person makes becomes an identity level indictment. So let's differentiate between destructive self-criticism and constructive self-criticism with the same system. Destructive self-criticism is global, identity-based, it has emotional flooding, it has future predicting, and it's often infused with inherited voices, like shame voices that came from parenting or early experiences. Constructive self-criticism is behavior-specific, time-limited, regulated, context-aware, and oriented toward repair. So I'm going to give you a difference between complaint and condemnation. Complaint, when you withdraw, I felt alone. Destructive interpretation is, I'm failing at being a partner. But a constructive interpretation would be, when I withdraw, it impacts our connection, and I need to respond differently in those moments. The broken mirror defaults to a destructive interpretation because identity level shame pathways are stronger, and repair requires strengthening behavioral interpretation pathways. Before we can move into repair strategies, there's one mechanism that matters, and that is attentional bias. This client, for example, focuses on quote-unquote the bad stuff I've done. Trauma conditions selective attention toward threat-related material. The brain filters experience to confirm prior emotional learning. This creates confirmation bias internally, where positive data receives less encoding weight and negative data receives amplification. That selective encoding reinforces the distortion that is in the mirror, and over time, the person genuinely believes the broken reflection because the system retrieves only that confirming evidence. Broken mirror syndrome is not simply low self-esteem, it is a structured distortion that's maintained by physiological activation, associative memory, perfectionistic threat management, and attentional bias, and repair has to address all four of those. If broken mirror syndrome is a trauma-conditioned distortion of your self-evaluation, then repair is not about just be more positive, just be nice to yourself. It is about becoming more accurate, and accuracy requires three things: regulation, differentiation, and behavioral specificity. That's a word, isn't it? Specificity. Start with regulation. When the system is activated, interpretation skews towards negative, because if your heart is beating fast and your breathing is shallow and your muscles are tense, your cognitive appraisal narrows. Before any self-evaluation, your nervous system has to settle. So take a few minutes to slow your breathing, do some grounding through some physical sensation, get down on your knees and grab your cigarette pack under the bed and say a quick prayer, anything like that, because without regulation, the mirror is going to be distorted. So in the session, if my client says that he hears a complaint and immediately escalates to, I'm a bad husband, the corrective step is not reassurance. The corrective step is slowing it down, that physiological cascade, and a pause that allows his prefrontal cortex to process that language rather than react to emotional tone. Second, differentiation. When a statement arises internally, like I'm a failure, we have to translate that and break it down. What specific behavior was actually under review? If there is no specific action that is attached, then the statement is global and trauma-driven. Translate it into observable behavior. For example, when I disengage during conflict with my partner, it affects our connection. This is workable. There is no global identity statement in that. Differentiation also applies to relational feedback. If the original sentence addressed behavior, keep it there. Repeat it back, accuracy. So, wife says, when you are on your phone and not present with me, I feel disconnected. And then rather than saying, got it, I'm a bad husband, you repeat back, when I'm on my phone in bed, instead of connecting with you, you feel distance between us. That prevents identity fusion. the repeated practice of separating a complaint from condemnation begins to rebuild clarity in the mirror. Neural pathways in your brain strengthen through repetition, and each accurate interpretation weakens the older association between feedback and defect. Third, contextual awareness without avoidance. Early relational experiences shape hypersensitivity. This explains the intensity, but it does not eliminate the responsibility for current behavior. Adult accountability remains intact. The difference is that accountability focuses on behavior change and is not an identity attack. So when he says something like, "I should be better, I'm 20 years sober," the recalibration involves recognizing that sobriety and an attachment injury are two different developmental timelines. Emotional conditioning does not automatically resolve with abstinence, and recognizing that reduces any kind of a moral overextension. Fourth, reduce perfectionistic threat modeling. Perfectionism here is functioning as an attempt to prevent criticism from landing. The corrective process involves tolerating imperfection deliberately. That means being open to feedback. Make a decision, allow it to stand. Observe an emotional response without an immediate correction. Survive the discomfort. Each survived instance teaches the nervous system that being imperfect does not mean relational collapse. Next, build internal authority. So when someone keeps saying something like, "just tell me what to do," that pattern weakens their self-trust, and internal authority grows with practice. So make small, autonomous decisions. Accept incomplete outcomes. Resist externalizing responsibility elsewhere. Doing this reduces your decision paralysis. Sixth, interrupt the bias. If your mind is automatically pulling up proof that you have failed, then you have to deliberately pull up other evidence. So this is not about scanning or repeating positive phrases. It's about facts, specific moments where you know that you handled something well, times that you did follow through, times that you regulated instead of reacting. If your brain is only retrieving negative data, it's going to strengthen a negative pathway. But when you widen the data set and you look for times that you have done it right, then the picture becomes a lot more accurate. Seventh, reduce the physical load. If your nervous system is constantly on edge, then your thinking is going to skew negative. Chronic stress keeps your body in alert mode. Sleep, movement, breathing work, and real rest are very important. You can't correct distorted thinking if your body is always scanning for threat. Repair takes repetition. The mirror does not just suddenly clear because someone comes to therapy. It stabilizes through practice. When you translate "I'm a failure" into a specific behavior, that distortion can weaken. When you calm your body before interpreting a situation, your judgment improves. When you hear feedback without turning it into an identity verdict, your sense of stability grows. Broken mirror syndrome describes a system that has been trained to evaluate itself through threat. Constructive self-criticism evaluates behavior, it considers the context, and it stays regulated. It's structured, it's accurate, and it's trainable. That is a difference between self-attack and self-compassion, which go back a few episodes if you didn't get to listen to that one. When introspection becomes accurate instead of punitive, growth becomes sustainable, and that is doing the work. Thanks for spending the time with me. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with somebody who may need to hear it. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others around you. Remember that we're all doing the best that we can with the tools that we currently have. And we are all capable of growing past them. If you'd like to reach out or connect, send me an email, brian@naplesintegratedrecovery.com. I hope to hear from you there. And in the meantime, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.